Yeah, first of all, I want to acknowledge my co-authors. Samir is lead author in this. She is also here listening. I think Arushi is listening in. I got to change that. Samir is starting off as assistant professor at Oklahoma State University in the fall. So I guess officially it starts in August. So I guess it's still correct. But she's a postdoc with me now. Arushi, assistant professor at the Management Development Institute in India. And so, yeah, so this is a collaboration of all of us. And this is a paper that we got. It's a working paper, so we're looking for feedback. They'll be taking notes and, and if you have questions. And typically, if you have a question related to something that we did as I'm presenting it, feel free to raise your hand so I can, clarify. But other than that, I'll probably answer questions at the end regarding everything else. So let's start here. So, give you a background of me. I basically operate in three different communities for the most part. So, my original community is AIS, where I do some kind of management informs. So, I do, whether it be publication or conferences or service or journals. That's one community that I would call that more the business school community. Then there's the ACM community, which is much more of a computer science community, ACI, CSW, HRI, human robot interaction. I'm heavily involved in that community. And then since I've moved to the robotics department, I spend a lot of time in the IEEE communities, more human factors, Romaine, ICRA. These are more robotic conferences. So I sort of span those different communities throughout my career, especially in the last 5 to 7 years. I have two apartments. One is in the School of Information. That building should actually change because we got a new building. And I also have an apartment in the robotics department. That's the new Ford robotics building. I said new, but it was built maybe 5 years ago. It's funny thing is that when I'm in the School of Information, which is much more human-centered, you think of a human-centered computing, I'm sort of the hard science person that does experiments and statistical analysis that people think is a little bit too much. Then when I go to the robotics department, I'm sort of the soft and fuzzy person who studies people. So I sort of go back and forth from those communities. I consider myself a post-positive. If you know what it means, then you know what it is. If you don't know what it means, then that's good for you. You keep on. Uh, oops. So see here, next thing here. So let's get to the topic, talking about service robotics, right? So defining service robotics, I would say service robots are robots that are autonomous systems. To some level, you can think of them as autonomous fully or semi-autonomous, helping humans perform service tasks. They have a physical embodiment, so they're different than, let's say, a chat box. And they can also be considered a lot of times because they have a physical embodiment and they're autonomous. People see them as, others or more than just things or objects. The actual size of the service robotic industry is huge, right? It's growing. I think these numbers are probably understating it now. I'm sure if I went and searched now, these numbers would be even increase. I'm talking a lot more about the hospitality robots, which are in particular growing. And in the future, we expect that robots should replace one human employee on average. That's how much penetration they think people will have, robots will have. Service robots and their adoption. So there's a lot of benefits service robots in terms of communication, data analysis in real time. So when they're performing activities, you can actually see how many people they're serving, the orders, what's being ordered. They have the potential to increase productivity, increase satisfaction. They're used a lot in cases of issues of safety. So instead of putting humans in unsafe conditions, especially even in restaurants. And they also a lot of we're seeing a lot of this custom service delivery now being allocated to these robots, right? Some of the problems people have, there's this big fear of job loss, and I get a lot of that. I get called to do a lot of interviews where people say, "Hey, a robot's going to take all the jobs," and it's like, no, not really. People get frustrated because working with these robots, they don't necessarily behave like a human, so they don't. It's a big thing where people think they can just insert a robot in place of a human, and everything will be fine, and that's not the case. There's often a loss of autonomy, according to the literature. People feel like they lose their autonomy because they're sort of having to work with the robot. Depersonalization, and this becomes pretty important in the restaurant industry, where people, I will caveat by, and I'll mention it, where we're talking about restaurant robots. I want to make it clear that these are American restaurants, and the reason why that might be particularly different is that uh, unlike Australia or Europe, people in America who work for restaurants, they depend heavily on tips. So like a lot of what people are doing, really good employees in restaurants are really good when they make the customer feel special. So really good people who are waiters or whatever, right? So it's almost an art as much as a science, right? Where in Europe and other places, they don't depend on tips. So that's a big difference that I want to highlight. Surveillance, that's a big issue. Robots. I tell people when they're talking to a robot, it's recording everything they say. It's not like you can just talk to it like it's a friend, right? And competition. People feel like even if they're working on alongside a robot, they're competing to some extent, right? Those are some of the problems. So this is the big picture I have. I've been doing a lot of work with human and robot collaboration. We have this idea that robots are going to replace humans, and I'm thinking no. I think robots and humans can work together, right? And so the question is, the sort of this bigger question that I've been working on is how can we provide quality work for employees collaborating with robots, ensuring that their work remains engaging, meaningful, and satisfying while promoting human robot synergy in the workplace, right? So I get a lot of complaints. I know there are certain companies that are using a lot of robots, let's say in warehouse activities, and the human workers hate it. They complain they feel unsafe. There's all this, things associated with it. So it's not, it's not something that we can guarantee is going to work well. And one of the big problems we have is that, people will take a job because they need the money, but they come back to the job to see their friends. And to what degree you begin to replace some of their friends with robots, that's also a potential game changer. So why restaurants, right? Because you think about it, there's a lot of different service industries I could look at. Why restaurants in particular? It turns out restaurants are a pretty fascinating place for a number of reasons, right? So one, labor costs are huge in restaurants. They account for 30 to 50%, right? This is why, so basically if you could use a robot to save on labor costs, it has a huge impact when it comes to restaurants. Restaurants are one of the largest private sector employers in the U.S. and I would wager around the world, right? I mean, think about how many restaurants you run in, you come in the counter, they're huge, right? As a percentage of industry. They also have one of the highest turnover rate, right? So the idea is that basically they do have a problem. In the best case, a lot of their skilled labor will leave. So if they can find a way to deal with that, so imagine having turnover costs being high, but having labor costs high, but people constantly leaving, right? Also, restaurants adopt technology as fast or faster than any industry that we have. Think about it, right? If you go to restaurants, you often see them with new technology a lot faster than you see any other type of business, right? So restaurants are surprisingly very much into adopting the newest technology any given time. And turns out restaurants have one of the most diverse workforce in any industry when it comes to any dimension. And they also tend to be a lot of people's first job. So it's a wonderful ecosystem, right? Because so you can imagine there's all this going on. So if you're looking at issues like adoption or use of robots, you have a good ecosystem that allows you to look at it in an environment that has a lot of what I would say dynamics and allows you to generalize a lot more to the broader population in some ways. When I say restaurant robots, I want you to know what I mean. It varies. So I think a lot of people may have seen this Beller bot or things like it, where these are robots that deliver you food to the table. But if you look at White Castle, for example, what White Castle is a hamburger franchise in America, they're using a lot of these flippy robots to make the hamburger and fries. There are now robots to make salads. There's a lot of companies that. And one of the growing industries is actually to have robots make drinks. Turns out that that's a pretty, from a scientific standpoint or engineering point, it's probably the most easiest thing, right? A big problem with bars is that bartenders tend to pour the alcohol unevenly, right? Which is, I mean, it makes sense, right? If you're a bartender and you want to get a tip, you might pour heavy to people who come every day, right? But from a standpoint of an owner, that causes a lot of problem, right? You want to get your drinks down to a science on how much alcohol goes into a drink. One of the ways to do that is essentially with these bartenders, right? These things can make drinks scientifically and they're relatively cheap and it's not that difficult to do. This is not a hard science, right? And similar, okay, making pieces, right? These are examples of restaurant robots that are increasingly popular. I don't, in the last year, I haven't been to one city that hasn't had at least one restaurant with a robot in it, surprisingly. I mean, these things are heavily penetrated in societies now. Maybe a few years ago, it sounded a little bit more like hype, but I would challenge you to go into any city that you're located in and see if you can find a restaurant with at least one robot. I would wager you have it. Um, so I would say these are coming, but to some extent, these are already here. So let's talk about the big picture. How can I achieve this objective? How can I create a situation where people are working on robots and they enjoy it? They're not only productive, but their work is meaningful and engaging. This is, I think, a pretty important question. Turns out that this is not a new question. This is not a new question. It's kind of an old question, right? So if you go back to pre-industrial age, when people, at one time in America, I'm using America example, if you made dresses, it's because someone in your family made a dress, right? It was, and you learn how to make beer from your uncle, right? So people basically had these family-owned businesses where, it was part of their identity, right? So if you were a dressmaker, it was who you are, it was who your mom was, your aunt was, it was who you're going to teach your daughter to be. At that point in America, I tell my students, we had a combination of capital and labor. They were the one. And as a business owner, if you made a dress, you dictated to some extent how much you were going to get from it. You also dictated your schedule. You had a lot of autonomy. You had a lot of satisfaction. You made the whole dress. You can imagine this culture, right? Then we go to the Industrial Revolution. Now we're making dresses in these massive sweatshops, and you're only making one part of the dress, right? And you don't know how to make anything else in a dress. And you don't consider yourself a dressmaker or a dress worker. You consider yourself a factory worker. And you don't dictate your work conditions. You don't dictate your autonomy, and you don't dictate your pay. It's not who you are, right? So we had to shift and so we went from everyone being happy, enjoying their work, feeling ownership, and to a situation where we got the opposite of that, right? It was a huge problem after the Industrial Revolution. Most people accredit Taylorism to do this. To solve this problem, people came up with the job characteristics model. I'm not sure if you people are familiar with that model. It's quite common. It was developed by Hackman and Odom in the 70s. The goal was to ensure employees remain engaged, motivated, and satisfied. And the idea was, okay, how can we identify the key factors that led to a job being motivated, satisfying, and engaging? And if we can do that, we can use that to evaluate and structure work in a way that was useful for employees, right? So here's the actual model. I'll walk you through it, but it goes like this. There are basically five job characteristics that determine if the work was going to be meaningful, responsible, and led to knowledge of results. And if it did, it led to employees being motivated, performing better, being satisfied, and less likely to quit. So it went like this. These five characteristics: skill variety, the extent which the job required you to do a lot of different skills. Then there was the task identity. Think about task identity, the degree to which you can do a whole job. So, for example, instead of just making one part of the dress, which would be low task identity, you made the entire dress. That's high task identity, right? So you can actually see, hey, I have a dress I made. Not I made, one thing that I don't quite see how it would ever get to be a dress. How important you thought your job was to the organization is task significant. How much autonomy that you had in terms of how you could do the job, and the amount of feedback that you got, and how well you were doing, right? So, and that if you take these things, that basically they led to one of three critical psychological states. And so I'll walk you through it. So it kind of went like this. In particular, I guess I'll go back a minute. So basically, the three psychological state, job meaningfulness, to what degree you felt the job was meaningful. There's job responsibility, to what degree you felt you had a lot of responsibility in a job, and the knowledge of results, which led directly to these four outcomes: motivation, performance, satisfaction, and turnover intention. And in particular, the actual model was more specific when it said basically this: these three things, the skill variety, task identity, and task significant, all led to the outcomes of motivation, performance, satisfaction, and decreasing turnover by increasing job meaningfulness. So that was always that was hypothesis one. Hypothesis two in the model was that increases in job autonomy would lead to outcomes by increasing job responsibility. So the more you felt responsible on a job, the more motivated you was, the better you perform, and the more satisfied you were, and less likely you were to leave. Similar feedback led to increase in knowledge of results, which had the same thing, right? So these were the three basic sort of mediation models that they proposed originally in the model that's been used an awful lot in the literature, right? So these are the three things behind this. The job characteristic model is not just a theoretical concept or model, which it is. It's actually used a lot in industry to actually understand. It's used not only to basically evaluate existing jobs, right, but also to create new jobs. So if you're making a new job and you want to know if people are going to be happy in it, you could theoretically, and you could really say theoretically, but you could use this as a model to determine how happy people are going to be in the job. If people are unhappy about a job, you can try to evaluate why they're unhappy, what's causing it, right? And the idea behind it was to allow corporations to balance, efficiency with well-being. So you wanted a job where people were productive, but also happy, right? So that was the idea behind it. And I also think, we can use this to design better technology, right? So I'm proposing that basically, if you wanted to design technology that people were going to work with, one way to evaluate that technology when you design it was to use the same job characteristic model. So at the same time, I'm sure you all read the IS literature. There's this massive call for us to begin to think about theorizing or how work is going to change from an academic standpoint with these new AI technologies or intelligent technologies, and that we maybe have to rethink about how we come up with theories because maybe existing theories that were meant for more automation may have to be extended or rethought when people are working with more intelligent machines, right? And you see a lot of this in OB literature, but a lot of it in the IS literature. We also see a lot of it in the service industry, right? So the idea is that basically we may have to rethink some of these theories in light of these new technologies, and so maybe we should think about extending theories or even come up with totally new theories, right? And you see a lot of this coming out in a lot of journals. So here we are. So what are we going to do about this? How are we going to address this? And so going forward, here are our objectives of our method and approach, right? So one, the first thing we wanted to understand the actual context. So basically we want to understand, okay, how people in restaurants, first of all, what makes restaurants different? What's the context? And how things are going in that environment. We want to understand. We also wanted to identify key variables, right? So if we were going to use the job characteristics model, we wanted to see what is it that likely to be important in this new context or not important, right? Maybe even, be able to generate some new hypotheses that are different and actually confirm those. And in doing so, we could maybe adopt the JCM model perhaps to this new context and actually try to confirm it and lead to what we think a building of new theoretical foundations, right? So to actually see to what degree our current existing models are valid or not, and do they have to be extended and changed, and if so, in what way and how they should be changed. So to do that, we had two studies. In the first study we did a mixed method study. It was more exploratory, where we talked to employees who were working in restaurants who were anticipating working with robots. So these were people who didn't work with robots. They had a lot of experience in the current environment. We talked to them to actually get what they think was going to change and the issues that they came up. Then we do study two with a different set of employees who were, and this was done like a year or two later, who were actually working with robots to actually see if what we learned in the study one actually did translate over to study two. So imagine if we concluded in study one we had to make changes to the model or not. Could we confirm this in study two? So this was our overall picture. So for study one design, it went like this. We actually sent out this survey to people who work in restaurants, and the survey was set up like this. Imagine it had every element of the job characteristic model. We asked employees who were working in restaurants, okay, if imagine working with restaurants, how would you see that changing your job? Would it increase or decrease? Things like task identity, but we asked them per item. And anytime they selected, they thought it would decrease or decrease greatly or increase greatly, then a text box popped up and they were asked to provide an example on how they thought that would happen, right? So they said, okay, this is really going to increase my task identity. Then we said, okay, well, can you give us an example of how you've seen that happen? Mhm. So we got both quant data and qualitative data. So this first set, 220 people working in restaurants. The average age was about 37. There was a breakdown of the gender identification. People worked full time. They have been working about 10 years or so. So this was that. So we actually, we looked at the convergent screen validity. It worked well. Everything worked out. So our first test of the quantitative data, we saw basically we found evidence that task significance was important, mediated for all the potential outcomes, but not skill variety and task identity, right? And we actually published this paper in the Australian Conference on Information Systems. Hypothesis two, we found out that job autonomy led to increases in responsibility, which led to increases in motivation, but didn't seem to have the impact on performance, satisfaction, internal attention. This got published in Romain 2024. Then we did hypothesis three. We found out that feedback increased knowledge of results, which was related to motivation, performance, satisfaction, but not turnover intention. And this was published in the AMSIS in some form or fashion. Each of these conferences were not published as a hypothesis. They were a little bit more than that, but that's just to give you an idea if you want to get the source of information. Then we looked deeper into the data, and what we did this qualitative exploration of the data to see what was going on, to engage in what we call bridging and bracketing. So bridging was like to see if we could find evidence, so to see if we can say, okay, what's the evidence to collaborate what we found quantitatively, and bracketing to say, okay, why didn't we find this, right? What was going on? So I'll give you an example of that. So for evidence that that we find that supported our quantitative data, when we see relationships between job meaningfulness and motivation, we see people saying things like, I would be I would be less important because robots would be doing all the important tasks that I would normally be doing. I feel like I would have a lesser role. Comments like, again, interaction with my customers is central to me, and not doing that as much would have a direct impact on my job satisfaction. So we see comments like this with motivation. No one expects the robot to take responsibility for things. I would have to. So these are all people anticipating what they think is going to happen. Working beside a robot would make me more aware of how efficient production would be, therefore causing me to self-evaluate, right? These are all the comments of people who are working in the restaurant now, anticipating how their life might change if a robot came. Likewise, we looked for things to contradiction. So, there's comments when it comes to job meaningfulness. Remember, this was non-significant, right? But we looked into the data and we find comments like this. Since there would be less for me to do, I can't see how meaningful my limited work would be to the company. So we saw some, I feel working with a robot would reduce the amount of social interactions and collaboration instead trying to bounce off a robot that might be programmed incorrectly. I feel some responsibility. So we are seeing in the early analysis, we didn't find any significant results between these relationships. But when we dug into the qualitative analysis, we are finding some evidence to indicate that these things are related in the data, just on a much deeper level, right? So if we add it together, we see that basically we find evidence for a lot of the hypotheses in the model, even so the actual things that are green are things that we found evidence for, even though we didn't find evidence from it originally, right? There's some things we did not find evidence for. But overall, we do find that the model does seem to be robust or could be robust, right? Then we went a little bit further and did more exploratory, looking for emergent themes. And something popped up every time we were going through analysis. We saw two themes that popped up repeatedly. So one we labeled perceived usefulness with the employee, right? So these were comments that said people thought the robot is going to be useful with them, right? It's going to help them do their job. And so we got comments like, oh, working in a tag team way as I'm doing one thing and the robot doing another thing, right? These are all people who believe basically the robot's going to help them be better employee. So we've seen a lot of that in the data. We also seen a lot of the opposite, where people thought the robot was going to be very useful without them. So it could do a lot of things that they would do. So in that case, you can imagine the first is more of a complementary. In this case, we saw a lot of evidence that people thought a robot was going to be substitutary. It's going to replace them. So comments like robots would be taking over jobs, so people would be performing less tasks. It would make me depressed, like I was being outsourced or something. Comments like since there would be less for me to do, I can't see how meaningful my limited work would be to the company, right? So we saw these two emergent themes, and they were everywhere. Either people sort of thought the robot was going to be help them, or it was going to replace them. That was all over the data, right? So we sort of thought, okay, it seems like if we could maybe extend this model, the job characteristic model, with these two concepts of working with, helping, being useful with the employee as opposed to being useful without the employee. So we saw that as a possible extension. So after study one, we did so study one was good, but it was had limited because we were talking about people who were basically anticipating working with robots, and that may not be reliable, right? So that's one way to look at it. Two, we also saw two emergent themes, but once again, that may not hold over if the people who are working with robots, right? So we're going to conduct study two, where we actually do more of a confirmatory analysis of the emergent themes and actually look at the job characteristic model with people who are actually working with robots in restaurants. So we go to study two that we recently completed. So we're going to again we're going to test the original hypothesis of the job characteristic model like we did before with this data set, but we're also going to explore by testing two more hypotheses related to both perceived usefulness with the employee and perceived usefulness without the employee, right? In addition to the original hypothesis. So here we actually have online survey of people working with robots, but this time the actual questions are asking people, like working with a robot increases, so we're asking more direct questions about their current job working with robots. And again, if they thought it was, a big, if it was agree strongly or not, then a text box would pop up and they would provide more qualitative examples of what they would mean. The only difference is they're actually talking about how their job changed right now in relation to a robot, not how they think it might change. And we also included measures of usefulness with the employee, which are what we see typically in TAMP studies that we adopted. And we created some new items related to usefulness without the employee. They should be without the employee. They're new tests. So online survey scales, we tried to use PLS because we felt this was more of an exploratory new area, so we thought that was more appropriate. This was 424 restaurant employees, aged about 37, which they were quite similar, more balanced than before, but these full-time employees. They have been working in the industry 7 years, but they've been working with robots only 3 years. So to give you some idea. So here's a breakdown. We actually went more depth. 2.5 years working with robots. They actually, according to them, their company had been using robots for at least about on average 3 years or so, but a lot of variance. So that means that on average, they haven't just adopted the robot. They have been working for a while in the organization. Here's where the educational level here. And so we see it's kind of what we expected, right? A lot of high school, some college, nothing unusual. Employer's job. So some of the people, so remember, these people work with robots, and these employees had different jobs. Some of them were servers, some of them were cooks, some of them cleaning people, and the robots had different types of robots. So some of them were working on robots that were, in the front desk. Some of them working on robots and serving food. Some of them working on robots as cooks. So you had all these different types of robots that we had here. We checked for convergence and validity, and everything held up. So our first hypothesis in this data set, we find everything holds up except for a relationship. So when I say hold up, I mean we actually tested for mediation effects, right? So basically, all these are mediation effects except for the relationship with turnover intention. Does someone have a question? Okay, no, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, so we see that hold up except for turnover intention. Next thing, hypothesis two. So here we see a little bit different. We see that everything holds up with job responsibility and motivation, but we don't find a significant relationship between job responsibility, performance, and satisfaction. And we actually find a negative relationship between increases in job responsibility and turnover and turnover intention. Um, so, and then, I think that should be okay. I think that's wrong. I think that relationship should be a positive. I think the increase in job responsibility actually increased turnover retention. I got to get rid of that. That was the opposite. I don't know how I made that mistake. And about the three, we find everything supported except once again, turnover intention is not supported. So let me walk through what we just said to clarify some things here. So why didn't we find any relationship between job meaningfulness and knowledge of results and turnover intention? So we looked into the data and we see comments like this. The employees love their jobs regardless of the robot, right? So robot or not, I love my job and no robot's going to take that from me. So some people basically didn't care about the robots. Like, I don't care. I'm not leaving my job even if I'm not too big with the robot or not, right? We saw a lot of that. Some people actually embraced it. Some people thought, okay, look, the robot basically is could be a good thing. They're coming, so I have to get used to doing this. So it's not going to change my job. It didn't lead to them to wanting to leave or to stay, right? And then it also depends on the task performed by the robot. In some cases, people might have thought the robot, was they can avoid it to some extent, right? Or they felt like they were doing something so unique. And this is where I think it becomes important to remember this is the USA, because a lot of these people felt like their value added was the rapport with the customer. Like they weren't going to like the robot was never going to replace their relationship with the customer, and that's why they were going to be okay. Other factors is that, hey man, we got no better job. As long as they keep paying me, I don't care, if the job sucks or not, I'm not going anywhere. Here, I guess what I was trying to say is, I guess I got this wrong. Basically, in the original job characteristic model, job responsibility increased turnover and actually decreased turnover. That's why I got this backwards, right? In our model, we found that it increased, and that was different. That basically, as job responsibility increases, uh, the actually turnover intention also increase. It should be opposite. As you give employees more responsibility, they should be less likely to actually leave, right? And the reason why we saw that is that people basically felt a lot of increases in job responsibility was associated with working with the robot. It needed help. It needed to be, you have to change work to fit it. You have to check on it. You had all these things that basically you had like an additional responsibility involving the robot that was not necessarily something that you wanted to do or thought about, right? So in this case, your job responsibility increases, but you were actually still more likely to want to quit because of it, which was different to what the original job characteristic model had. Here, we're still going to the data. So we were trying to figure out why we didn't find a relationship between this. I think some people felt like their performance was not related to the robot, that they could separate it in some cases. Some people felt like the robot, I think we got a case where some people felt like the robot actually was positive, and some people felt like it was negative. So I think it was like a wash as we went across the actual data set, right? And so I think here's what basically maybe it was basically how the job was set up. If they could avoid like if they could avoid the robot in a way that they could still do their job, this was something that we were actually still going through on the data. And so, okay, then we went to hypothesis 4 and 5. Okay, how would our new constructs, or not new constructs, but at least one of the new construct, and how would the old construct fit in the model? And we ran analysis, and we found out surprisingly, both of them were positive, and even perceived usefulness without the employee was a good thing, except there was no relationship for task identity. I think that's mainly because they felt like in cases where the actual work was separated from them and the robot. Here we found similar. We find that both constructs were significant and important. Perceived usefulness without the employee didn't have a relationship on job responsibility. Once again, I think it's because they felt it was loosely coupled. And we find so here we so what we find with perceived usefulness with the employee actually reduces turnover intention. What you expect, right? Ironically, on the other side of the scale, perceived usefulness without the employee only had an impact on turnover intention, and it actually increased turnover intention. So the more they thought the robot was useful without them, the more likely they were to look for another job. Right? Does that make sense? So then, okay, then the next question is, what do we stick these two constructs into our existing job characteristics model, right? We want to extend the model. Where is it, where did it go to help us do that? So to help us determine that, we actually ran the first model all by itself and looked at the fit indices and the R squares. I'm sure you heard of the standardized root mean squared residual. And the idea is that this value should be less than 0.10, to be acceptable. Less than 0.08 is good. I mean, that's kind of how it works. The Bayesian information criteria, typically, the lower it is, the better it is. Right? So imagine that this first model I'm showing you is the baseline. This is what we get if we don't add the other two hypotheses in the model. If we add these two constructs and run them to job characteristics, we see that we actually get a worse fit than we did if we did not. We can see the two comparison. We really can't compare R squares because the original model does not predict job characteristics. So we can only compare the fit indices, and we get a worse fit, and the fit is over 10. So typically that's not a good sign. If we run these two constructs into the critical psychological states, we actually get a pretty good fit. We get a 0.74, which is below 0.08, which is pretty good. If we compare that to this model, we don't get a lot of bang for the buck on the R square or even the BIC. So we get a better fit, but we don't get a better explanatory. So what we did was we actually ran another model where we tried to replace, we call it the replacement model, where we basically got rid of job characteristics and just ran the relationship between these two constructs into psychological states and compared that. And we can see we don't, in the substituted model, we get a worse fit. It goes over, it's still, it's not bad fit at 0.101, but it's not good. And by virtue, the explanatory power goes down. Then if we run the next one here, we get a really good fit of 0.071 if we run these to the outcomes. And then we compare them we compare the R squares, and they actually are significantly better. You can see that we explain more of the motivation, a lot more of the performance, more of the satisfaction, and a lot more of internal intention. So each one of these increases in R squares are significant, right? So we get a better fit and a higher explanatory power for the analysis. We did try to run a substitute model too to see what we got, and we actually got a really good fit, but by virtue and the R squares went down a lot. So if we take across all the models that we looked at that fall below 10 as valid models under the criteria, we get the original model, which is 0.09. Then we get the model with these two run psychological state, which is a better fit. If you look at the average variance explained, not much different in that and the Bayesian information criteria. If we go to the next model of 0.071, we get a really good fit, and we also get significantly better explanation of the outcomes, right? And if we go to the actual substitute model, complete substitute, we get a really good fit, but we don't get much explanatory. So we think if we had to pick between these models, we think we would pick this model here. We think overall it's the best model. So, but we're still open to a conversation because we haven't made a decision yet. So overall, if we go back overall implications, the things that we find that are different when it comes to the JCM model and working with robots, an increase in autonomy due to increase in job responsibility, actually increased turnover intention. That was new. Typically, it's the opposite. And other contexts, when people use this model, they find the opposite. We think that might be due to the increasing labor associated with working with a robot. People often call this invisible labor, where basically people are now asked to do additional work because they're working with a robot that no one sees and they don't get credit for. And we have some evidence of that. We actually asked people about invisible labor, and we have some evidence that people are engaging in this invisible labor. In essence, you have to engage in more work in order to work with the robot that a lot of people don't see. We also saw increases increases in job responsibility due to autonomy that had no relationship with performance or satisfaction. Once again, I think we're actually still trying to go to the data to get a good explanation of this. We also found that job meaningfulness and knowledge result did not impact turnover intention. We think this could be related to the employment opportunities in the industry, the people in restaurant, how people stay because they need a job. But we also are still going to the data. I think there were cases where people felt like it was really good and they wanted to stay because of the robot. We actually found evidence of that. And we also found people who thought it was bad and they kind of wanted to leave. And so we kind of got both of those going. So maybe that led to non-significant results. Some of the things we think about also, and it's something we've opened to discussion about, we think people might want to recognize that perceived usefulness is a key factor, and that maybe you can reconceptualize it into two elements differently. One, perceived usefulness with the employee versus without. And this might be unique to work environments where people work with autonomous technology. So that might lead to new insights into both job design and theories that looked at technology adoption. And we think this could influence the strategies implementing AI in workplaces. I'll stop there. This is normally the actual slide I would give if I was talking to people in computer science, because they typically want to know how it's going to change the design of robots. But if you have questions about this, I'll be happy to answer them. But at this point, I kind of want to hear feedback or any questions that you guys may have.
Something I was wondering about this is you're looking at the restaurant industry in particular. Are there other kinds of industries, and would you see different kinds of results based on the type of industry it's in? Do you think it's because it seems like in some ways what you've got is somewhat, you talked a little bit about how the restaurant industry is kind of unique. Is that really the case? How unique is it, and would that change things, I guess?
Yeah, I think I don't know. The big question in that context is it unique to America? So, I think that's the thing because basically, if you work in a restaurant, I think in Asia, I think in Europe, I think in Australia, they don't rely on tips, right? And so
Oh,
in
yeah.
America, people rely on tips, and so that for them to get a tip, you have to be very nice to the customer. Give them give them a compliment. Oh, that's a nice dress. Oh, how can we help? There's all this that goes in there where basically the robot could interfere with that, right? And so that becomes a much bigger issue. So to what degree that's not there, then maybe you see some different results, right?
So less of an occupational difference, and well, I guess it'd be occupation and culture, maybe, but
Yeah, it's I think well, yeah, that's a good point. But I do think I wonder. I gotta think about that because I wonder if our two constructs like perceived usefulness without may have a stronger impact in the context of say a European restaurant than an American restaurant maybe.
hmm.
Because people in
Anyway, just
America,
thinking
there's
about it.
some belief that they can't be completely replaced by the robot, right?
Yeah. Well, they don't have a desire to, like, different kind of relationship work in some ways too, I guess.
Mhm.
Anyway, all right, good response. Thank you.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Lionel. Thank you so much for this fascinating study. I just want to have a quick question. I might have missed it. So how many restaurants were involved in your study?
So yeah, so this was an online survey. So this
Um,
was yeah, so these were like all different restaurants.
so have you
So
controlled for like different types of restaurant, like fine
yeah,
dining,
yeah,
fast food
yeah.
restaurants?
I don't know if I had that here. Did I? Let me see. Maybe I didn't. Yeah, we did. We ran all these controls, and Samia, feel free to jump in because she ran the analysis. We have to control for everything here. Um, Samia, do you want to jump in to
Yes,
tell them
sure.
about the controls?
So we did not control for the type of restaurant, but we did control for the type of job. So we created
Mm.
a variable where we matched the job of the robot with the job of the employee, and we controlled for that to account for those differences.
But we have the data, right? We have the data about the type of restaurants.
Yes, yes, we do.
Yeah, because I'm
Yeah.
wondering, I think you just mentioned, Lionel, you just mentioned very good points where um, so people crave that connection between the staff and the people who dine in the restaurant. I'm wondering, would there be any difference between, say, fine dining restaurant and fast food restaurant regarding the service they provide? And that probably impact on how people perceive their like job autonomy, job
Yeah.
characteristics. I think that would be an interesting control to add on and to see,
Yeah.
well, would that make a difference?
Yeah, we could definitely. I think we asked them about what type of restaurant they worked for, whether it was large chains on
Mm,
that. So we have that data, so we can definitely put that in there as a control
yeah,
variable. Yeah.
yeah. Another question is probably I think Semyon. I'm sorry if I pronounce your name wrong.
That's
You probably mentioned about the type of robots as well. So you controlled for the type of robots in
yeah,
restaurants.
if by type you mean what kind of work they did in the restaurant.
So we have like cooking robots, like
Exactly.
cooking the hamburgers,
Yeah.
and also
Right.
the,
Yeah.
like the carts, like delivering food. So like
Yeah.
these are the
Yeah.
major types I am aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. We have.
Sorry.
Yeah, we control with that by matching that with the employee. So we thought maybe if you were a cook, you might have a different attitude with a robot that would deliver food versus a
Hmm.
robot that cooked. So we control for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it does make sense. And also, I feel like it's very interesting to see people in the US. They actually feel like, oh, I'm afraid of like robot may replace my job because I did some interview with like Australian people. They are more like they are less fearful of that in
Oh,
general. So I think it's a very interesting phenomena, the difference between different culture and background.
yeah.
Yep. Great
Yeah.
suggestions. Thank you.
I think Joseph had a question as well. Sorry, and maybe it'll help if we put our, the little hand up as well. That way, we can make sure that everybody gets asked in order.
Sure, yeah. Hopefully it'll be kind of quick. Um, I'm really interested in the design implications that you
Oh,
put at the end. Um, and I wonder if there's some thought to like the robot morphology or the way that we're designing these robots, where your design recommendations seem to really try to help the employees have the robot like a mental model of the robot as a sort of like helpful tool rather
hmm.
than this like personable like social thing, because the
Yeah.
employees felt the social part that was their purview, and
Yeah.
better tools is great. So I wonder if that
Yeah.
has some design implications about what we design these robots to look like and act like, to do things like better disaggregate the robot and the human in the feedback customers are giving. So if the
Yep.
robots appear and act more like tools, maybe that helps on this perceived usefulness aspect, where they don't feel threatened for the parts of their job they actually take ownership and pride in. Is there any sense you have
Yeah.
of that kind of thing, or like what
Yeah.
that might look
So
like?
yeah. So for example, when things we said the design robots to support rather than overshadow the humans employed by emphasizing the human touch and customer service. So the idea we found was that the humans had no problem with the robot bringing the food to the table, but they want to interface with the customer. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So like if you design the work so where the human would be, because they would call it the human job, which it was they would see basically interfacing with the customer, and everything else behind the scene they felt could be automated, right? So the robot would be like you said, a tool. So we talked about about the designing the work in such a way that the robot would support the humans, not replace the human, right? And also talked about like about this idea of so a couple of things. One, because people felt like they had like human work. There was human work that the robot could not replace, and they didn't, and so they wanted separate between the human work, and the robot work, and they didn't want them mixing up because they felt like if it did, it made them feel like a robot, like you were dehumanizing them to some extent. So the work should be designed to the actual robot should be designed to complement the humans, not overshadow them. Now, one of the things that we felt also that was clear is they wanted to make sure that we made robots, or I'd say that we made an ecosystem where the customers could rate them separate from the robots. They were very, very adamant. They did not want their performance to rely on the robot, right? Because they didn't. So they wanted some way that they recommend that they have a work system where people could rate the robot and them separately. So that's one thing. The other thing I ran into is, and this is problematic from an employer standpoint, is they wanted the ability to customize the robot. Like they wanted the ability to determine to have options to set what the robot could or could not do when they were working with the robot. And it's not clear to me that a manager would allow that to happen, but that was something they wanted.
Cool. Yeah, I was really struck by some of the examples too, where like the bartender robot that were mixing drinks, that felt like it was stepping into the domain of what a bartender actually might take pride in,
Yes.
versus the ones I think you're describing were the ones that are just kind of like the trays on wheels. I think a
Yeah.
server would be totally fine with having somebody drag the tray out there for them. So that was
Exactly.
kind of a distinct thing for me. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
Yes, I'd just like to add to that that we did not find evidence, although we were looking forward to reading comments on appearance, but we did not find any evidence of people being intimidated by the look of the robot or the appearance of the robot, but more so for the functionality and the jobs that they were doing.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna go. I'd be happy to wait for other people, but as there's a little bit of a lull. So I'm gonna ask a qualitative question, but as Lionel I think knows, I'm far more qualitative than I am quant. So I'm really interested in the invisible labor part. I mean, I'm really, really interested because I've seen elements of that in open source as well. But in open source is often recognized, and you're suggesting that in your data, or at least in the qualitative comments that you received, this was not being recognized. So I'm wondering, did you ask any further questions of these different people in your survey, or did you have extra questions added where you could see that where the companies that they worked for actually recognized this extra work and suggested that their task had actually become enhanced, or they were given a separate job role? I mean, if there is such a possibility, they can be given a specific role where they actually maintain and take care of these robots. Did that show in any way any changes for other employees, but also for the new work that may have emerged?
So we have that data because we asked them, okay, what work did you do for the robot? And then we asked them, was this a part of your job? Right. And so the idea was that, so we actually have that data. I think what we have so far, what we saw was it turned out to be a bigger problem, at least right now, with people who were managing. So we have another data set. I think for a lot of employees, they felt like it was, so it varies. Some of them felt like they get recognized with it, but a lot of them didn't feel like it was either it was either they didn't get recognized for it or it wasn't what they signed up for. Right. So yeah, okay, your job is to be a waiter and take care of a robot. Well, okay, they get recognized for that, but they're not really getting anything other than the fact that they got one more job responsibility.
Ah,
Yeah,
okay.
so it wasn't like, so it's like, okay, I'm just going to make you, I'm going to give you this one more task. And some of them felt like, I think even if they wasn't there, they still had to do some of it, right? But I thought there was, based upon what we looked at, we thought it seemed to be a much more problem for managers of these restaurants.
I mean, because it's interesting if you think about factories, and you talked about Taylorism, and I was wondering, even the factory workers, even on oh God, what do they call those? Oh, sorry, I'm blanking out. When you're working and then you have to keep filling up boxes, and if something goes wrong with the system, basically there would be people who would step up and try and fix things because they were so comfortable and used to it. So it wasn't exactly exacting on their role, is because they knew how quirky certain machines were and they were
Yeah.
familiar with them. So I'm wondering if over time this changes as well. And
Yeah, I think so. That's a good point. Yeah, it's not clear to me how much. So, for example, imagine in your scenario, I don't know how much freedom they had to like reprogram the robot or to do anything other than
yeah,
reset it, right? Or to move it.
yeah.
That's why I think I don't know if they're at that level where like they know, oh, this is the X56, it always shuts out. And so I got to do this 1, 2, 3, right? I don't think they're at that level yet of adoption.
Okay. Yeah. And then last thing, sorry, and I'll let everybody else ask. I was wondering, you talk about it, work with employees and then without. And I was wondering, I mean, there are large debates within AI technology at the moment, probably more in managerial rather than IS. But this is dichotomy between automation and augmentation. I was wondering where you're positioning this paper, and depending on that, of course, then you may change terminology because it does seem to be like an augmentation versus automation sort of discussion going on here.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. Samuel, do you have any comments or Risha? Any comments on that? Because go ahead, Samuel.
Yeah, so when you say positioning, are you trying to talk about the literature that we are going to be?
Yes, yeah. So I was wondering where you might feel that it would be a best fit for this work.
So currently we are positioning it in the IS literature, and the contribution we're trying to make is in the IS literature, just because there is a lot of debate on the changing nature of work, and there are calls to review existing models, how they can be extended or adapted to AI-enabled technology is how we call that in the IS discipline. Now, AI-enabled technology can include a lot of different kinds of technology, and they can include, Chat GPT, but
Yeah.
also robots. But we are trying to keep the scope limited to embodied intelligent agents where we bring in physical robots. So that's how.
So, I think we were trying to do both of those things, but
Mhm.
with the perceived usefulness and without. Like we were trying to say, okay, there, no, I guess we really thought maybe, one would be perceived as more useful or not for the customer. I mean,
Mhm.
for the employee.
Mhm.
But I don't know. I think I guess we're hoping to say they should be separated. I think we
Mm.
were hoping to say basically we should separate those two, and here's how we can separate it to sort of capture their impacts on the adaptation process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I'm sorry. And I let Rui, I beg your pardon, but just so when you talk about separation, are you talking about it at the point where you're actually talking to organizations, so actually changing the model and the theory to suggest that actually in robotics, as opposed to AI, the conversation should be about separation.
No, 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 no. If we're talking about adoption of autonomous systems,
Hmm.
that we have to separate them from being both useful with and without the employee, and that's a way of capturing the augmentation versus the replacement argument that you're talking about. But we do. But if I speak to the literature, I would say basically, if you wanted to, the more powerful way to approach is to design the robots to augment. That's what I would say. I would say that basically if you design them to augment them, then you get all the benefits, right? You get
Hmm.
if it replaces them, there's still some benefits. People still got more, but then people are starting to think about maybe it's time for me to leave, right?
Okay. Thank you. That was great. I let Rui go on.
Oh, well, hi, Lionel, this is a very interesting topic, and I kind of work in the same topics. There's just a one paper that I'm working on that are kind of related to this. So I was wondering, first is I see a lot of robots or AI algorithm, driven technology. We start talking about agency, right? So like whether this robot or AI is working with me as a boss or as a colleague or as my teammates or someone below me. So and in our project we're looking at it, but in a different industry we're looking at like a service, but like a technology service industry. So I think the context, the background is different. So my first question is, did you look at this kind of factor? Because I would imagine people who view technology differently will think, whether their job is at a crisis or whether if for instance, if I think the robots will work for me, then maybe I'm more encouraged to stay, then I have some help that,
Hmm.
assistant or support from the technology, and it's ultimately they perceive that the workload will be decreased, right? But if they
Yeah,
think the robot is taking their job or as their boss, then they may have very opposite, like different feelings. And the
yeah.
second is just kind of realistic because we're working on this, like whether what kind of role the employee actually playing in relation to working with robots or AI. And if you have any, variable that are capturing this, did you find that would be a factor, whether this would make a difference?
So the first question, we hope and think that the perceived usefulness and without is a way of capturing it. People thought the robot was going to, right? That's our way of bringing that augmentation replacement conversation into like our idea is that yeah, you can do that, but here's how you do it. You take something like perceived usefulness and you separate it, and it turns out it actually works in terms of there are two separate constructs. We actually, they're not the same thing. And so you can build on the existing framework and take it a step further to sort of like to take that into account, right? So that's our hope. I don't know if you can make an argument that maybe there's more to it than that, we also have control variables like their attitude to work on a robot in general too, right? But that is our mechanism to address that argument. That basically, if you could get them, if you can ask them if they thought it was useful with them or without them, that would tell you their attitude toward it. At least that's what we're hoping to be the extension. The second question you had was, yeah, we are beginning to explore some areas where we're trying to see how it could be, uh, how managers can make things better. And we are sort of so we have another data set in particular that we're looking at managers of these restaurants managing robots, where we're actually beginning to go into the data and actually see what they think they're doing that's working and what's not working to address. But we're still early in that analysis. But that's part of it. We actually want to go and say, okay, how is this changing the job of the manager, and how they're adjusting, and what adjustings are actually working and what adjustings are not working, and how we could lay it out from a theoretical perspective.
Thank you. Thanks for the answer.
But
So,
question, but do you think that perceived usefulness and without actually addresses your first question? Do you think that's a viable way?
honestly, to some extent, because
Mm.
I think we're looking at different things, particularly because we particularly like dig into how they view themselves in relation to the robot or AI, right? So
Yeah.
like, what am I? And also we look into what's the role that are kind of defined by the organization. So for instance, it's like,
Oh,
okay, if let's say in this context, in the restaurant, if the restaurant owner wanted this robot to be a more supported role, but actually the employee feel differently. So there might
okay.
be some conflict into what I am thinking as an employee or what the restaurant owner actually wanted me to feel. So that what can be a conflict, like different
Yeah.
purpose of using the AI. And if those aligns with each other, like if the design and what actually the employee feels align with each other, then there might be a positive, outcome,
Yeah.
lead to positive outcome. So that's what
Yeah.
we're looking at. I think it's fundamentally different,
Yeah.
but I just wondering whether you find this is a factor, and because we're in the process of a revision, so we wanted to, this is kind of like a more example to us, like in a different industry. If people do find this would be a factor, then it's actually more encouraging and brings more contribution to what we're looking at.
Yeah, yeah, no, we're actually in a process of, I agree with you, something different, but we are actually going through the data, and we're trying to answer that question from a standpoint of the manager. So we actually have
Mhm.
data that we're going through right now this summer, where we actually answer that question, but from the standpoint of the manager. And so, but we're in a process of doing that. So,
Great, great. I look forward to hearing what you find out.
all right.
Um,
I also look forward to maybe we can talk later about, what you're doing,
sure,
and yeah,
of course. Yeah, interesting. Yep, yep. Thank you.
thank you.
Anyone else with some questions? I mean, most of mine are qualitative, so I mean, I'm not
Yeah,
sure if I can help.
I
Yeah.
just have a comment. Hello, Lionel. Nice to see you. Thanks for your presentation. I think the only thing as I was reading this, I mean, based on your theory, all the variables that you've measured make sense. But I was wondering from your explanation of what you were trying to say, you were probably looking at role ambiguities as opposed to task, related issues. So where would, the importance of role, what other colleagues have also shared about role and role conflict, role ambiguity, and all of these factors would come in, because I think this particular model probably best applies to situation um, where, yeah, it works very well for the restaurant industry
Yeah,
where it's
yeah, yeah,
task driven,
yeah.
whereas actually the issues that are coming up, your findings suggest that there is more about role conflict and role
So,
ambiguity or clarity.
So it's two issues. So one, I think part of I agree with you in context, because basically in the restaurant industry, people are flexible. Like, you're not, if you're like, you don't do just like one thing, right? There's a lot more people moving. I mean, people tend to be a front or back, right? But you could, so you have the flexibility to sort of fill in for the robot, right? Like the robot can do one thing, then if we know we have to order the food and deliver the food, you can fit yourself into that process, right? So it's like, okay, if the robot's going to deliver the food, then okay, you go around that, right? So that's not. We tried to capture some role ambiguity in this control variable where we can count for if the employee was working with someone robot in their same role, right? So that's how we try to. It isn't the same thing. I do think it's. I mean, so role ambiguity. I think we could put that as something to look at in the future because it doesn't fit in the job characteristic model, right? So we did look at the job characteristic model, so we didn't go outside of that. So that's another thing. And I think role ambiguity is interesting because we do look at some other things that might be useful in that. We looked at the flexibility. So I would argue, for example, that the autonomy sort of captures some of that, right? Because to what degree they have autonomy that they could work around that role ambiguity. To what degree they don't have any autonomy, then they're sort of stuck with it, right? They don't have a lot of flexibility. Samuel, you want to talk? You got your go ahead.
Yeah, so even though the JCM is task-driven, because there was a lot of qualitative analysis involved, I think role ambiguity is something that we want to talk about in the discussion in future research directions, because when we talk about particularly feedback and knowledge of results, people talk about, hey, this evaluation is not mine, or is this the robots or mine? So what am I being evaluated on? So that is where the whole concept of job differentiation and role ambiguity comes in, which managers or people who are trying to integrate robots into restaurants need to be more considerate and conscious about when they bring robots into the restaurants.
Yeah, so that's again going back to other colleagues' point of what do you see the robot as, your colleague or
Exactly. So I
a
think
tool or whatever. So I guess
yeah,
that's where your discussions would be mostly surrounding because that's what we see. Because in task
Yeah,
level, it's not the
that's
task
just
level,
part.
we understand. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's just something that is emergent and it's coming up, and we talk about it as something that should be done in the future. Not necessarily, it's not a direct finding of how the
yeah,
JCM should be
yeah,
adapted, but it's
yeah.
something that more and more
Yeah,
should be.
I think Jake. I mean, so it doesn't take into account like employee relations, right? There's job satisfaction, but it doesn't look at the employee's employee, right? So that's the limitation of JCM model. But I also think it's basically so. Remember, we look at if people think so. We're looking at it if people think it's going to replace them or make them better, right? But that's not the same thing if they think it's a colleague or not. Right? That's not the same thing. So we're not looking at like a social presence. We're not looking at it if they thought it was like a coworker or not. We're looking at it purely from a functional standpoint, not from a relational standpoint from that. So there's definitely we don't look at the relational standpoint of this robot, right? If that's what you're sort of referring to. Is that what you?
I was just giving comments that will help you to
Oh,
probably
yeah, yeah, yeah,
further,
yeah. But
I was not criticizing because
no, 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 no,
you
no, no.
clearly are basing on a particular theory. So
Yeah.
you have boundaries about your theory, I understand. But because it's a mixed method, you have room to kind of talk about everything else
Yeah,
at
you're
the
right. No,
later
no, no,
stage.
no.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I was trying to say basically, I was trying to say that basically that you're right, that is a component that basically we don't actually do that. So I don't want to, so I want to be careful that I don't try to overextend it, right? Because like the whole perceived useful and without is this idea that it's a functional thing, right? And we do miss some of that. I guess we can, I don't want to overclaim, like I don't want to start reaching for stuff because I think that's important. But I think it's important enough to study it on its own because I can definitely see where like that's like if I was going to look at that, I would look at a whole host of new outcomes. It would be very important, but it would be like I wouldn't want to overstate my findings to speak to that because I think it's very important. That was my point. I think that's something that you can do a whole nother study on.
Just to also add on your issue about turnover intention being positive, right?
Hmm.
So if you have more job responsibility, what I understand, you can correct
Yeah,
me.
yeah,
You have more job responsibility, you actually have more turnover, right? But
yeah,
in the original
yeah,
model, it was the opposite.
yep.
Yeah, so I think to actually show this, you might want to do another study where you actually leave them to interact with the robot at one stage, like a two-stage study, with two-time difference, but where they had one level of job responsibility at some point in time,
Oh,
and then the robot was introduced, and then after 1 year, you check again, and that's the only way
yeah.
for you to actually check that if the responsibility increased, because you have two different studies, but we can't really see that. Is it really because of the robot, the responsibility increased. See what I mean?
Yeah, so from that standpoint, we have the qualitative data, right? We have data from them complaining about that. So, but that's all we have. You're right. So, but we don't have like so we actually did take a second wave of data for the outcomes, but it wasn't like a long time ago. Like it was like a couple, just separated. But you're right. If we really wanted to, so that's the problem with the data, right? Is that we have two studies, but they're not connected in the sense that they're not the same data set. Exactly, right. Yeah. Yeah. But you're right. I mean,
Yeah, so I'm not sure.
yeah, yeah, you're right. Yep. So, any other questions? I mean, you see any other concerns you guys would see? Like if you saw the paper, you thought, okay, yeah, what else did you look at?
I was just thinking, how do you fit everything in the given page numbers? That's all.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was
that's the
even
problem.
thinking
Yeah,
about
so
everything else.
so that's a question I wanted to ask you guys. Do you think it's worth, so like the whole first study, right? This whole qualitative mixed method, you think it's worth it? You think it's basically, because we could basically say the hell with the, two study thing. We can just say we ran a study and we decided that we wanted to use perceived useful with and without, and here's what we found. But is it worth having the first study to set the things up? Because we wanted to do this, do everything right, right? But which, like I said, it doesn't really pay, I guess, because basically you got page limit, right? We can say did two wonderful studies and blah blah blah, but people may say, "Who gives a crap? Just give me the study, give me the second study, and just hypothesize 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5." You know what I'm saying? What do you think? Is it worth trying to make it all fit together or not?
I believe the first study, which is on anticipation, is not so useful for me. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I don't see what's coming up from that really for your model,
So
because
perceived,
anyways testing it again.
but like perceived usefulness and without, is that the idea is that that's where they came from. If we had that in the model without having studied one, would you be like, where did that come from? What's going on here?
No, it comes already from your qualitative data as well, right? Even in the second study.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, I don't know.
So
Doesn't
the
perceived
qualitative
usefulness
analysis,
come from your qualitative study from the second one as well?
no, so it's coming from the qualitative analysis of this of study one. So
Oh,
anticipate
okay.
changes.
Yeah, so I guess you have to have it then.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you guys think? Do you think like if that's the big thing, should we just reduce study one to just finding that and get rid of everything else from study one? Like, don't go to like the bridging and bracketing stuff and blah blah blah. Should we just?
Yeah.
I am not sure if I'm the right person to ask this, but I'm trying to think. I think Rui probably wants to say something because she's
Oh.
on.
Yeah. Go.
Okay,
No,
but
I was gonna say that yeah, it's a tough decision because yeah, I can for mixed method the page limit is a thing, and
yeah.
if I were you, without knowing all the details, if you think that's key or a big contribution, then I would describe it and put it on online appendix. That's one way that I've done that. But and if next round they say, well, we want to see more, then you show more. It's just the strategy I would see. And if you can
Yeah.
fit in more, and you think that's more important, the process and everything, then add it. But honestly, I think you just wanna to be able to include it, right? So
Yeah.
the detail is probably less important, but you need the conclusion, right? You need the how we get there. So I would add a couple, or maybe if you can, one paragraph or two, and then yeah, again, without knowing all the detail, I'm sure there might be other challenges
Yeah.
reaching
Okay.
that
I mean,
conclusion.
okay. So I like that.
maybe because I'm from a different, method completely. For me, that was actually very informative. So I'm totally an outlier here, and
Yeah.
you can totally discount what I'm saying. But for me, it was actually quite interesting to see that what people think is going to happen, and then what
Yeah.
actually happens, and how that completely changes their perspective. In some cases, not all of them, and where it changes. So I agree with the bracketing, and perhaps you could downplay or perhaps have less detail, but for me to see those two stages, even if it's not exactly the same people, but that's not usually so important in, I mean, as far as I understand it, in quant. In qual, of course, it would become even more important to have exactly the same people. But even then, we would be able to go further afield and ask, if we wanted to do more interviews. So I actually really liked it. I thought it was quite interesting to see how your concepts actually emerged and connected. But again, I'm a qualitative researcher, and I like to see the logic and the dots.
Yeah.
That it sort of makes it deeper for me and more interesting.
The other alternative is to separate the papers, to have one paper talks about how we find these two new kinds. So imagine one paper with no perceived usefulness and usefulness, you just run the JCM model straight for study two. Then do a separate paper where we have two studies, but it's all about the perceived usefulness with and without and how they impact the model. Maybe. I don't know.
Maybe I have missed it. I had to take a phone call from Ed Stan's camp. When you talk about the how you position those studies, so are you going to position the two study as a mixed method? I would imagine, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
with the quantitative being dominant, what's the relationship with the two method? Like one dominant,
So
one, yeah.
it depends. So in study one, the qualitative is the dominant one, right? That's the one that basically tells us everything for the most part.
The
And in study
qualitative
two,
is the dominant.
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But in study two is the opposite. It's going to be the quant is the dominant with the qualitative giving support. Or not? Does that make sense?
Oh, you mean the two study forming two papers?
Well, no,
Or
no, the two studies with one paper right now.
okay, so each
But
study have two method,
yeah, yeah, exactly. Both of them have
and
both.
you're going
But
to include all of them.
that was the original idea, right?
It's a lot,
But
yeah.
yeah. So, but the alternative is okay. We'll just have the quant. We have study two when we only test the JCM model. Do a
Mhm.
quant study and have the qualitative trying to help to explain what we found, right? And then do a second paper where we do two studies, but mostly the quant. And then the second study is just basically how the perceived usefulness and without replaces, maybe it explains the outcome.
Mm.
Maybe it's just that. And right, does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of data, very rich data, so
But
I'm sure
yeah, but then you have the
figure out.
problem. The problem you have, and I feel like you have a problem where if you cut the data too thin, then you don't have a good journal publication. And you got two C publications, and in our field, at least in your field, you would have one A publication and two C publications, right?
Yeah. That's a tough decision. But I'm sure it's rich data, so that's good. So you have room to play around. If you submit it to a top journal, then they come back say, well, how do you do this and that? Then you have
Okay.
some
That
background
makes
data.
sense. That's what we're hoping. We were hoping we submitted it and get an R&R at top journal, and then they can help us, because we have all these ballot studies, right? But
Yeah.
the same problem. I mean, Samia is just starting off on the 10 o'clock, so she doesn't have a lot of time, right? That's the only thing about it, right? When the IS journals take so long, you
It
just don't
is.
have that much time to be Maggie.
Yeah, I'm just thinking if you were to submit it to a top IS journal, probably two studies would be better.
Okay.
And other like interdisciplinary journals probably split it to different studies. But from my like if this is my paper, I would like put them into one study because I want to showcase the entire package. And I think they flow really nicely. But I do think that like two mixed methods in one paper probably is a little bit is a lot. But probably for the first study, you can consider highlight the qualitative part because
Yeah.
the perceived usefulness with
Yeah.
robots and without robots, that's the major contribution.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, and you can just leverage more the interviews you did, or is that an interview or just the quotes, the feedback
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
users?
Feedback. It's feedback. Yeah.
The
It's cool. I
feedback.
mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
pretty thick. I mean, it's a lot of data. It's a lot of data.
Yeah, so I think that would be at the highlight of from the first study, and then the second study highlighting more of the like model comparison and theorizing parts as well. I think that would be a better flow.
Okay.
I do have a question though. Sometimes I got feedback from journals. They told me that my model is too big. It's not as so they nowadays they prefer like smaller models with with less attributes, constructs. So I'm just wondering what's your view on this, considering you have a relatively big model?
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you on that. So the problem you have is if we say we're using the job characteristics model, and they're going to say, well, where's the rest of the model at if you use the job characteristics model, right? So that's my
Yeah,
concern. So I would kind of, I would be open to them saying, well, this model's too big, take these off, then we could hopefully,
oh
I'll be
yeah,
round two, right? But I think, so if I had my thinking, for example, I would drop motivation from the outcome. I don't think motivation is a good outcome variable anyway, right?
Mm,
And so you can reduce it, or you could drop some, but but then you wouldn't be testing the whole job characteristic model, right? That becomes the issue that you want to test that. So I really I see what you're saying, and something, yeah, it's something to
yeah,
think about.
yeah. Thank you so much for that. And regarding the previous question regarding the au- um, automation and augmentation, um, I read some paper and they so a lot of journal they are saying they want to see how to balance augmentation and automation instead of like picking one of them. I'm wondering if you have looked into this part of the literature.
No, I don't think we looked at the no, I don't
I
think we
think
looked at
that's
that part
from
much.
Management Journal.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good point. Yeah, no, we don't. It could be something we talk about in discussions. I mean, in some ways, they're both good, right? At least in the job characteristic model, they both have positive outcomes, except for the turnover intention. That's the only thing where they separate it.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, it's a good
yeah,
point.
yeah. But very fascinating study again.
Can I ask a strategy question more, like in the
Sure.
sense of, like as an author, and also because you've been on editorial boards and still are on many top journals in IS and probably beyond. So when you have quant work like this, or largely quant and mixed, of course, as well, you said if you split this into two studies, do you submit them simultaneously or do you have to wait for one? Because I'm thinking in qual work, if we do separate, because we have a completely different theorization, it is possible to submit them simultaneously, even with the same data set. So how does that work with quant? This is just a
Yeah,
curiosity.
yeah. You could submit it as long as you disclose to the editor that you're doing that. As long as they both know about each other, then you're okay.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, as long as they both know about the other, the right hand knows about the left hand, then they're okay with it. And then they could basically determine to make sure the papers don't merge together, right?
But there's no dependence in your study on what you find in the first one for the second paper?
The only really dependence is the perceived usefulness with and without. That's the only dependence really that goes from one to
Yeah.
the other. Yeah.
Okay. And all right, and you could deal with that without saying study one has done, this is where it
Well,
emerged.
I mean, we could just ignore perceived usefulness with and without, and just test the job characteristic models for robots.
Oh,
Then we could
okay.
do a second paper to talk about the perceived usefulness. Like maybe we would drop job characteristics and just have them predicting psychological states, or just have them predicting job outcomes to say how important they are to job outcomes, maybe.
Okay. All right.
Um,
Okay,
but
thank
I,
you.
I mean,
I was just trying to
yeah.
see how you actually pull them apart.
But I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I think our first goal is to try to do both of them, but to reduce study one to only focus on the qualitative data coming from perceived with and without, maybe,
Hmm.
and then just and then go from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, that was really great. Seriously, I mean, your data, but also how you speak to it with all the qualitative quotations sort of brings all of these numbers alive. I mean, it was fantastic. The knowledge of robotics is really, really cool. So
Thank
thank you.
you.
I'd love to see how you'd see this in a care setting as well, where it's not
Yeah.
so much about I mean, it's less about tips and things like that, but it's definitely still very much a relationship. Caregivers also feel that they build actually a much longer term connection
Yeah.
with their patients. And if you remove that, or even if you have augmentation in that case, I wonder what kind of situation that would give rise to and how they
So
would feel.
interesting. So I actually attended a workshop in Leiden, the Netherlands. Yeah, yeah. Lightning Universe. And the workshop, one of the things they were looking at was this fascinating thing where basically people are going to put these home healthcare robots, right? But these robots have to have a multiple purpose. They are they are the interface between the home healthcare person because they run out of home healthcare people, right? And the patient. And so designing a robot that could speak to both of them is where the challenge is, right? Right, because basically that home healthcare person has to come back to the home and the robot should be helping them along the way, right? And so the robot has to be designed to speak to them, but also speak to the patient. And then the questions become issues of privacy. So for example, should the robot tell the home healthcare person that the patient have been cheating on their diet or not? Right. So it's all this. So it's like trying to figure out how to design this robot to where basically it would be loyal to the patient because it's and then the question would be and then the whole question was, well, who owns the robot? And it turns out and in the Netherlands it's a state because it's a state healthcare system. So the robot isn't working for the healthcare provider themselves. All the patient is working for the state. So so all that dynamic trying to figure that out, right?
Oh, that is awesome. I mean, are you going to
Well,
yeah.
no, I mean, this was workshop that we attended. I'm not doing this work myself.
Oh,
People
okay.
we had workshop on it about the different challenge. It was about the challenges of it. And so I was more like an expert giving advice on the potential challenges of design. But I think it's an open, I think they're pushing it in the Netherlands, right? Because they have a huge problem with healthcare. So, and a problem in the sense that they want to be able to scale up to help people at home, but they
Mm.
don't have enough healthcare providers. And so the answer to them is to put a robot in the home. But now that sounds simple, but when you actually think about what you have to do to make it happen and what it means, it becomes much more complicated from a social and legal standpoint.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome, actually, because you mentioned surveillance in one of your early slides anyway, didn't you? Right.
Exactly. And so, I mean, this is something, I mean, I'm not, this is not something that I'm doing right now, but this is
Mhm.
something that was part of the workshop that they were looking at. And there were a whole host of issues. And one is simply how to design a robot that can speak to both of those people, right? Because a robot speaking to a healthcare provider person is a different robot speaking to the
Mm.
patient. And then what role does the robot have in coordinating those two people together,
Mm.
right? So it's, yes, so, yeah.
Yeah, and also how do you make it look? I mean, I'm also curious as to, is it fluffy and warm and nice and or is it, yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
conscious
yeah.
of time and I'm taking more of your time and in your co-authors. So thank you.
Oh,
If
thanks for
there's
the feedback. I really appreciate everybody's great comments. It's great.
no, it was a fabulous talk. That's all I'm going to say. It was really, really cool. And it's nice to have somebody, sometimes, it can be an interesting paper, but the performance itself can
Oh,
be
thank you.
not so engaging. You were absolutely brilliant. So thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank,
It was really good.
thank you for having us. And also, like, once again, thank my colleagues, the ones, Samia and Rusha. I'm not sure she's here now. Maybe she left, but yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Um,
much. Yeah,
Thank
really
you.
good.
Good luck.
Thank you
Thank you.
guys, and
Thank
thank you
you.
to the
Okay.
audience as well.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
And
Take
good luck
care.
to you too. You never know, man. I tell these people when I submit a paper to the IS community, I have to say, which paper can I afford to wait for 3 years before it comes out? You gotta say, right? And in the best case, right? So if you got
In the
something
best
really
case.
hot and interesting, you're excited about it. It's like, okay, I'm excited about this. I want to share with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Okay, now I gotta wait 3 years if it works out before it comes out.
Yeah,
It's,
yeah.
If it works out, there's always these
yeah.
big horrible ifs. So
Exactly. Exactly. You might stall, you go a couple rounds. I was at a conference a few years ago at ICIS. This is maybe like 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And they asked us and said, what do you think the two rounds where a paper was most likely to get rejected from MISQ? This was like maybe 8 years ago. Know what they were? Do you want to know what they were? Round one and round five. That was, yeah,
oh my
back then.
God.
Yeah, that was
I
me.
mean,
Now
round
they've
five is
changed.
criminal.
Yeah,
You do
yeah,
not
they've
hurt
changed since
authors.
then. Yeah, right.
That's
But
brutal.
yeah, I mean, but it happens. I mean, I've had a paper that went 9 years, and
Oh,
you go
God.
one or two rounds here, and they say almost they like it, and they do this, and you do that, and they say, oh no, actually that was a bad idea, and then you submit somewhere else, and yeah. So I don't know. I guess I complain. I guess I'm getting too old, but yeah, it's
No,
just
but
like
you really do wish that the senior editor or whoever senior on the paper would kind of step in a little bit earlier than 9 years. That seems
yeah,
really,
I think they are. I mean, I think they are now. I think they're moving fast, but even fast by IS standards, it's like 3 years. And I have colleagues here Where if I tell them I have a paper that gets published that's like 3 years old, they
Yeah.
claim that's not research. It's not research anymore.
I know.
Well, it
Can
is research, but these are people who are now publishing on archives. They are people who they have papers that have 20,000 citations, and it's on published in archives and never been published. In some cases, they don't even bother sending the paper to a conference or journal because they've
Wow.
moved on to something else that fast.
But can I just say that one of the biggest problems with this fast turnaround, meaning, at revision 1 or 2 to get papers out, qualitative work suffers a little bit
Yeah,
more there because
yeah,
it needs time sometimes to
yes,
develop. In fact, there's almost this expectation that every revision will be absolutely brand new and written from scratch, in which case there's always going to be some surprises for reviewers. So I
yeah,
found this to be a way more lethal system to my kind of work, and I'm trying to find
exactly.
another journal.
No, you're right. No, I think
So,
it's not an easy problem, right? It's not an easy problem, and so it is, yeah, it's not an easy problem. So people sort of go back and forth trying to find that really sweet spot where basically you're getting your stuff out and people are excited about it, and